Oh, okay. Are you okay taking this off while we're up here?
Yeah.
Is your chair taller than mine? Why do I feel so much shorter than you? Are you just much taller than me? I didn't realize I was.
I think it is a little taller, yeah.
Is this on now? Okay, I think we should get started. Hello and welcome to our event today for Leila Mottley and her outstanding debut novel, Nightcrawling. My name is Louisa Smith, and I'm the very lucky host for today's event. I would first like to thank all of you for being here. We know you have lots of options for things to do on a beautiful summer day, and we so appreciate you spending your time with us. Whether you're in the room with us today or online from miles away, thank you for being here and for supporting Book Passage and our favorite authors. Book Passage has a robust author speaker series, and these days we are busy holding events both in the store and online. I hope you will have a moment after today's event to go visit our calendar on our website and take a look at all the exciting events coming up. In particular, I want to point out a couple, such as Michael Pollan on July 30th, Louise Penny on August 4th, Mohsin Hamid on August 6th, Anthony Mara on August 7th, and Colson Whitehead on August 9th. Book Passage is able to offer all of these great events because of support from people like you, so thank you so much for helping make this happen. One of the best parts of being a bookseller is championing new authors. In fact, we love doing this so much that almost 20 years ago, we started our First Editions Club, a club that is devoted to finding extraordinary books written by new and emerging authors. Many of the books have gone on to win awards and become widely recognized. Titles such as The Kite Runner, All the Light We Cannot See, The Orphan Master's Son, The Mothers, A Gentleman in Moscow, There, and The Sympathizer. Each month we read widely, those are words that are hard to say in order, to find something remarkable, something that makes the world stop for a moment, something that makes us think deeply and examine the world around us. And the one commonality to all of these books is how they give us a glimmer of the incredible talent that was able to produce them. And we know we'll be writing many of our favorite books to come. That is why today's event is so special, as we have one of the most exciting First Edition Club authors we've ever had here with us today. And they're going to talk about the remarkable book and their path to writing it. Leila Mottley is the author of the novel Nightcrawling, an Oprah's book club pick and New York Times bestseller. She's also the 2018 Oakland Youth Poet Laureate. She was born and raised in Oakland, where she continues to live. In Nightcrawling, Leila Mottley tells the story of Kiara, a teenager in Oakland struggling to survive in a world that refuses to cushion her fall from poor to desperate, reminding us of the brutal injustices that are easy for society to ignore and the strength required by those who live every day contending with them. The most powerful books are those that force us to acknowledge those too often overlooked, making their highs and lows ache in our own bones. Nightcrawling is an important addition to this set. In conversation with us today was to be one of our favorite First Edition Club authors from last year, Monica West. Unfortunately, Monica has come down with COVID and cannot be with us today. We wish her a speedy recovery, and I want to encourage all of you to check out her debut novel, Revival Season. It is a transporting coming-of-age novel that explores a complicated family and what it means to live amongst a community of faithful. My favorite part of these live events is being able to hear questions from our audience members. So please don't be shy. The authors also love this part of the event. If you're here with us, you just raise your hand. But if you are watching us online, please just add your question to the chat. We have an event staff here who will be monitoring them, and we will be asking them for you. Also, if you would like to purchase a copy of the book, we have them at the registers if you're here in the store. And if you are online, there will be a link provided in the chat. Monica will be personalizing these copies for people here. So if you are online and you would like it personalized, the best way to make that happen is to call the store during the event. And we can have that happen for you. And with that, I would like to welcome Monica. Thank you for being here. Monica, Leila, why did I switched to the other author there. Leila, as I do. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So this has been very exciting for you, debut author.
Yeah.
You now just turned 20, is that correct?
Yeah, I turned 20 last month.
That's amazing. So
Thank you.
last week?
Last month.
Last month.
The week after pub.
Oh my goodness. So did you start writing Nightcrawling? You started writing it before the pandemic, though.
Yes, yeah, 2019.
Can you tell us a little bit about how that came about, how you started that?
Yeah, it was like, I think a month before I turned 17 that I started writing the book. It was my third book that I had written, and I like to think about what I'm going to write for at least a few months before I dive in, because it is such a commitment. It's a long-term relationship with this book. It's 3 to 5 years, and so when I start writing, I want to make sure that this is a story I'm committed to, and that I put in all of the effort and time and energy it takes to tell a story in an authentic way. And this one came about in a couple different ways. It was partially inspired by a 2016 case where a young girl was sexually abused by different Bay Area police officers, and I mean, many of us are from the Bay and probably heard about this case as it happened, but I think that beyond the Bay, really, it didn't receive much attention, and that's indicative of a larger pattern of neglect of the harm of young women and young girls. And I remember being particularly struck by the way that the media talked about this case and the lack of attention to kind of the systemic harm of young girls, and particularly girls of color, and then this redirection towards the police department, the police officers, the repercussions for them, and not what does it mean to be impacted by this kind of deep neglect and lack of protection. And so years later, I was kind of thinking about this next book. I knew I wanted to tell the story of a teenage Black girl, because I think that we often don't get to read stories from the first person narrative perspective of teenagers in general, given a kind of validity and respect that I think teenagers deserve and aren't often given. And so I started there, and then as I came to Kiara, these two things kind of intersected.
I didn't realize that. So you started knowing that you wanted to write about a Black teenager, and then connected the story that you had read in the news earlier. And did you feel a certain pressure, given that it was a real person? Not that Kiara's that person, but that there was a real inspiration out there for telling her story?
I mean, I think there's always a pressure to make sure that you are telling the story that is most honest to these characters, but I also very much try to think of my characters as real people, and so Kiara became, herself, and she had a fully developed world, and getting it authentic to any true case wasn't important, because it became Kiara's story.
That's so interesting. And one of the things I think you capture so beautifully in your book is this unjust way that young Black girls have adulthood thrust upon them, that they're presumed to be older than they are, or at least the expectations of their behavior are different. And could you speak a little bit about that? Was that something that you were trying to address in the book? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it came with Kiara and who she was and the way that she was raised. And we meet her and her brother Marcus living on their own in their studio apartment in Oakland. And so much of how we come to understand them is through this dynamic of Kiara taking care of the people around her. And I think that throughout the book, we kind of see the way that she was parentified from a very young age and became a caretaker without any kind of actual choice made, and I wanted to kind of go into what it means to learn things about the way that we are supposed to behave and exist and navigate the world without ever actually knowing we're learning them, and then how that dynamic impacts a relationship that is full of a lot of love but also a lot of hurt.
Yeah, because she's taking care of her older brother, who has dreams of being a rap star, and she's just trying to make rent. So it feels as if both of them have different expectations of what success would look like. Like,
yes.
For him, success looks like fame. And for her, success looks like survival. Is that something that you see, a dynamic that you see in the community, or is that something that's specific for their situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think that many Black boys are taught from a young age that in order to be successful, in order to thrive, you need to achieve some sort of external success or fame or even athletic success, all of these things that are put in front of us about what it means to be good. Which ends up placing the value of a person in the things that they do and the way that they're consumed and not who they are. And I think that we see that with Marcus, who really believes that he needs to achieve this dream in order to be worthy and important and loved. And then we see the flip side of that, where Kiara doesn't pause to think about herself in any way for the majority of the book, because she just, that was never an option. And I think that seeing the contrast between these two people who have grown up in the same family, who are, probably the only two people who understand what it means to be a child within their family, also are kind of held within this tension of the gendered ways that we're raised.
And she doesn't really have, she's the mother to Marcus in a way. She's the mother to her neighbor's son, who's 5 in the book.
He's 9.
He's 9 in the book. He's 9 in the book. So she's taking care of a young child and somebody older than her. She doesn't have, her mother's not there. She's kind of isolated by that. Do you think that kind of, that's sort of powerful because it's a first person narrative. And to do a first-person narrative from somebody who is so isolated, who's always sort of giving out what their interior life was like, was it difficult for you to get that voice of what that would be like, or was it?
No, I think that I approached the book from Kiara's voice first and foremost. So before anything else, I learned her and how she thought and how she spoke and what her head looked like. And I do a lot of journaling from my character's perspective. So with Kiara, I did a lot of just day-to-day journaling about what her day was like, and just trying to fully understand her head in order to give her the most rich and complex interior world, because she doesn't often externalize a lot of her feelings. And so when we see her talk to the other characters, that's not giving us a whole lot about who she is, yet that silence is also representative of something else going on. But I really wanted to make sure that her interior monologue was more complex than I think we often get to see for Black characters, and particularly teenagers. And so I made sure that from the beginning I got to know her first, so that I could kind of give her that.
I love that you journaled. I love that. That gives it such a richness. And was this a handwritten journal?
Yes.
Do you find that it's different, that your writing is different when you're writing with a pen on paper versus on a computer?
It is. It's very different. I very intentionally write some things by hand and some on a computer, because I think that it changes kind of everything. It changes pacing, because we can type way faster than we can write by hand. It also, for me, it will always be a little more poetic if it's by hand, because I often write my poetry on paper. And then often, if it's a hard scene to write, I'll write it by hand too, to give it kind of the slowness that it deserves.
I love that. I really love that. That's so interesting. And you said that it brings the poetry in because that's how you write your poetry. Did you find that you had to pull back on some poetic influences? Yeah. And has writing this novel, so I believe you've always been writing both.
Yes.
Both, but you just got more attention for the poetry first, so everyone thinks you came from poetry, but you're doing both. But do you find that doing this novel, did it change your poetry as well?
Yes. Well, whenever I'm writing fiction, if I try to write poetry at the same time, I end up writing prose poems. And so I keep them pretty separate. And I try to write my poetry not on the same day I write fiction. Sometimes even like I'll have months where I write fiction and months where I write poetry. So I definitely try to keep a separation, but I think it's also kind of an ongoing challenge for me to see where the line ends, or where, even if there is a line, sometimes it blurs.
It feels like the poetry, you really see it in a lot of the imagery. I mean, I know a lot have been made about the pool, but also the scene, the funeral scene, and there's a lot of beautiful imagery in there. But I wonder if some of the poetry, were there people or places in particular that drew the poetry out of you more than others, or was it pretty consistent throughout?
I think that when I was describing Oakland, I kind of had to rely on poetry more because it's really hard to describe a place, particularly a place that is like both unique, but also that I hadn't left at the point that I wrote this book. Like I literally hadn't left for more than a few days. And so it was hard for me to even grasp something that I was so immersed in, and poetry helped me to make sense of it through language, which I think it's often hard to like place a location, but also like a history and like groups of people and all of these like different streets and different neighborhoods and feelings and all of these things into one description, and poetry helped me to kind of give it a different lens.
Oh, that's really interesting. I love that. And it's interesting also because Oakland in particular has had so many great poets come out of it. It certainly inspires people to write poetry. There are Oakland poets that inspired you?
Yeah, absolutely. Chinaka Hodge, I saw her perform at this event, and she did it with her brother and her dad, and they had like drums as part of it. It was beautiful. I think that the artists in general in Oakland, there's such it's kind of boundless. There aren't rules, or at least we don't follow them. And I think that makes it all the more special with poetry in particular, where the second you start like breaking the rules, it gets better and better and better. So I've definitely learned a lot from Oakland poets, and also like the history of rap and the merging of rap and poetry. There are just so many poets who are also spoken word artists or rappers too.
And there is something about having to read your own poetry and hear your own voice out loud that changes how you write, I think.
Yeah,
which
definitely.
I think is really helpful. I also think that poetry is something that we see a lot of teenagers attempting. Thank God most of our own poetry is lost to the ages. We'll never see our teenage poems again. But there's something about the kind of fight of emotions that happen within teenagers that can only be expressed through poetry. Is that something that you think maybe made you feel like writing this teenage voice more because of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's like a heightened sense of everything when you're a teenager, and I think that often when we exit adolescence and we kind of put this distance between ourselves and our teenage selves, we start to judge the person that we were when we were teenagers because they feel like less mature versions of ourselves. But I think that often what we call angst is really just this deep feeling, and like belief and faith and passion before it's been kind of trampled by the world. And so I think that that part of poetry for teenagers is also just like a place that hasn't yet been rules haven't been placed on it. And it's one of the few genres of art or writing that has kind of this limitlessness to it. You know, you write free verse poetry and there's not really a rule. And the second you learn that you don't have to rhyme in a poem, like that's then you can literally say anything. Right. And I think that in a world that has a lot of rules for how teenagers are supposed to behave, that kind of lack of structure helps
very
us,
appealing.
I think.
Yeah. I love that you just said something about how, like, as adults we start judging our own stuff. Yeah. And you even heard me do it right there.
Yeah.
Right?
Everyone does it.
But Kiara doesn't. She is not actually full of judgment. Like, with all these terrible things, she's making choices that, you know, sometimes there are no good choices. And you make it, and you were very good about not judging. There's no sort of judgment of that in there. Was that something you thought about when you were writing this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we also, it's in present first person too. So this isn't her looking back on her life. This is her in her present moment. So she doesn't even have the ability to retrospectively judge herself, which I think, like, maybe in 10 years she will have critiques about the way that she moved, but I think that that's kind of the beauty of it too, is like in our present moment we often feel like we don't have choices, right. and like we're trapped, and I think that that's very much real, whether there were other actual options or not. It's that sense of being trapped that ends up putting us in a position in which we really don't have choices, or the choices that we make are often only the one that we see.
It also makes me think of your book. I mean, these limited choices, these tough choices she's having to make, that she may be judging in 10 years. But often we put on individuals, like, you know, like, oh, you're feeling down, maybe therapy will help, or oh, you're hungry, maybe you should get food, or get a job if you don't have money. But whereas the actual solution is something that's systemic, like it's society has failed here, not your personal choice in what you make. And you've really addressed that beautifully with showing how society has failed her over and over again. The people that were supposed to be protecting her are actually doing the opposite of this. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, I mean, we see many different systems that create the conditions for Kiara to end up where she is. And I mean, we even start the book with the rent increase, which is a catalyst I kind of wanted to start with in the context of Oakland in 2015. The rapid influx of wealth meant that at that time in particular, like, home becomes precarious, and has continued to. And I think that as a catalyst helps us understand that, like, even the place that Kiara starts is not of her own choices, or it's a product of a system, and it's a product of many different systems kind of intertwining and combining to create these conditions. I think in many ways the child welfare system has failed them, and we see the reverberations of the criminal justice system through their whole family, and I think that it's important that we kind of understand them in that context, but also understand that context isn't what's being presented to them, and there's like this constant judgment and blame that I think they continue to reinforce too. We see Marcus judge Kiara for her choices, and we see the ways that, like, sex work is also seen through different characters' eyes throughout the book too. So it was important to me that is always kind of like the underlying current of the book, but also that might not be the first thing on Kiara's mind.
Right. And it's interesting, you brought up the criminal justice system, that the criminal justice system, instead of providing justice for her, is actually the source in a lot of ways. I mean, in some ways, the source of why her father is gone. And certainly the criminalization of sex work is partly why sex work is so allowed to, you know, have people take advantage of these women, and so dangerous. Was it difficult writing about that? Did you have to do a lot of research on that, or?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely did a lot of research. The other part of it, though, is that because sex work is not only criminalized but stigmatized to a place where you will find 10 million different ideas of what sex work is and how sex workers should exist. And so it was really important to me that I had a sex worker read the book for like very much logistical things that like you can't find online, and all of these kind of things that I think you only know when you're inside of that. So I had a sex worker read the book and provide that kind of insight. And then I did a lot of thinking about the way that sex work was portrayed in the book, and how we can see that Kiara's choice to enter sex work is really not the problem. And her kind of exploitation by the police officers and by all of these different people throughout the book is a result of the criminalization and legalization of harm to sex workers. So I wanted to make it clear that like this is Kiara's story, and there are so many different types of sex work and so many different experiences within it, and that really the major issue is that there is no systemic support of sex workers, and that creates these conditions that are dangerous, but the profession in itself isn't what is dangerous.
Yeah, it's interesting. What did she tell you anything, or they? I shouldn't presume that it's a she. Did they tell you anything that surprised you when they read the book?
I mean, there were so many different like things that I didn't know. We talked a lot about different types of sex work and kind of Kiara's choice to end up in street sex work versus other forms of sex work. And because Kiara's a minor, like there were a lot of different things to juggle. And it definitely made me think very intentionally about what form of sex work Kiara ended up in, and like how it ends up going for her.
And was there ever any pressure from the publisher or anybody to change parts of Kiara's story? Because it is a tough story. It's not an easy thing to open our eyes to and read about.
Yeah, no, my editor is incredible, and she at no point ever wanted me to shy away from anything. And I think that for me, I knew from the beginning, like it was very important to me that I give the most honest representation of this story for Kiara, and I was clear I was not going to change the ending. That was like the biggest thing, because some people want a happy ending, and especially for a book that can feel grim at times, I think we want hope at the end, and it was really important to me that the hope just wasn't found in the criminal justice system. That wasn't where we would leave the book.
Right, and a lot of people who are reading this book are not from Oakland, are not part of this community. Is there any fear ever about falling into tropes or having readers sort of pigeonhole what's going on and just sort of, I don't know how to put it, like gawking at it instead of really internalizing what's happening?
Yeah, I mean, I think that tropes are actually really interesting, and I find kind of a lot of I'm really fascinated by them, and I try to use them within my work. I mean, we see a bunch of tropes kind of turned on their head throughout this book, because I think that there are truths in tropes and there are falsehoods, and when we entirely write them off, then we neglect to ever actually interrogate them. So I mean, even with Marcia, we see kind of the trope of the white savior. With Marcus and Rap, we kind of get to understand the inner workings of how and why so many Black boys are obsessed with rapping. And I think that for me with Oakland, it was really important that I show a nuanced representation of it, because I think that we're often given a very binary way of looking at Oakland, particularly by outsiders. I've heard, you know, Oakland is dangerous and violent and crime ridden. And then I've also heard Oakland is the new place to move and be, and it's up and coming. And neither of those are an accurate representation of the city. And so for me, it was really important that we're able to see just like the vibrance and the beauty, and also the ways that like any city will hurt you. And particularly the ways that cities often fail their people, and so it was really important to me that we get to like experience the love of Oakland and kind of the sense of belonging, and also see it as more than just one thing.
You mentioned a number of different characters there in the book, and there's some really wonderful characters and interactions. Was there anybody in particular that you enjoyed the most having those scenes with Kiara?
I love Trevor, so I think that everyone loves Trevor. It was always a relief for me when I got to a Trevor scene, because I think that he just brings so much light into the book, and
It was a relief for Kiara to be with Trevor.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. He's a relief, and so he was always a fun person for me to write. I think that because we see everything through Kiara's eyes, it really depended on where she was at with each character at the time. I think Marcia was a really interesting one for me to write, and to kind of figure out the dynamic between them. There are a lot of scenes with her that ended up not making it in the book, but I write a lot of scenes when I'm unsure about a character that are just kind of exposition and seeing how they relate to each other.
Oh, so do you write a number of scenes and then just figure out which ones are the ones we're going to be including in it? That's really interesting that you do that. Wow. And I think I read that the two books you wrote before this, one was a fantasy and one was historical. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So you like to approach stories from many different ways, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, definitely. I think the first one, no one's ever reading it. I'm never going back to it. Like, I was 14. It should not be read. And then the second one, I actually like really enjoyed the premise of the second one. I just wasn't quite sure how to write a book yet. And so for me, they're both practice novels, and no one will ever read them. But I might return to the second one, which was the historical one. I don't know. I think that for me, I really like exploring stories about people who are often sidelined, and finding like a lot of nuance in people that we often only see in one dimension.
I think I also read somewhere that you are writing a book now that you had at first started writing it third person or omniscient narrator, and now but decided to go back to first person narrator. So do you feel like that's more your voice for at least for these stories that you're telling now?
Yeah, I think there's this kind of literary idea that in order for it to be like high fiction, it has to be like in third person, and exploring like older characters, and I think that I was unsure if I could continue doing first person, but I ended up back in first person because I think that it's just like a special way to approach a story. We don't ever get to be in someone's head other than like reading fiction from a first person perspective.
Well, especially since you're journaling from their perspective, you're really trying to get in their head. So why not have that be what you're doing?
Yeah.
Wow. So are you still working on poetry at the same time that you're writing this book?
I have a poetry collection coming out in the next year or so too, but I'm
really
also
slacking here.
I know. Really? I can't sit still. Yeah.
It's pretty impressive. This book touches on a lot of things that have been very hot in politics and the media lately. I mean, do you think of yourself as a political person, or is this a political book in some ways?
I mean, I think that we often forget that politics are about people in their essence, and so I don't necessarily think that my characters would say they're political or politically minded, but I think that everything that happens to people and to these characters is also a rendition of the way that politics impacts us as humans. So yes and no, I think. Yeah.
I think it's really interesting, actually, now that I think about it a little bit deeper, that people on the edge, where there is no safety net, of course, politics affects them far greater than people who have a cushion and can, you know, walk away from a situation if it's not working for
But
them.
we've kind of, as a culture, intertwined the idea of politics with an elitism that kind of excludes the very people who politics impacts most. And so I think that when I think about my books, I try to make sure that like the characters are first and foremost true to their own stories, because I think that the beauty of fiction is that we can't distance ourselves in the same way from characters and from a story as we can with the idea of politics, which we often think of in terms of like concept and theory. And so I want first for readers to come to my books as stories and to connect and invest in these people. And by investing in these people, you are also in some ways investing in the politics and the ways in which they become who they are and are limited from being able to thrive.
That's so interesting. And do you find that because you've done events now all over the world, not just here in America, do you find the kinds of questions or the focus of readers in Oakland versus, let's say, the Greater Bay Area versus United States, you know, Europe, are they different, or do you find the same things coming up again and again?
I mean, the same things come up always, but it's always interesting when I'm not in the U.S., there are a lot of like questions about U.S. politics, and I get asked like, what's your opinion on Roe v. Wade? And like just very kind of random questions about like how does the U.S. function. So I think in some ways
we all like to know.
Yeah, I think that often comes up, and then in the U.S. but not in Oakland, there are a lot of questions about Oakland and kind of many misconceptions about it. And so then here, I don't get those questions, which means like often the questions end up being more related to the book or even, you know, about specifically how Oakland is represented in the book, but not questions about like what it is. So I think that often when I'm anywhere else, the questions are like clarifying, like who are you, where are you, like what even is this, and I think that really speaks to the lack of representation of a lot of historically Black cities in literature, but particularly Oakland.
What are some of your favorite books about Oakland?
I mean, there's like the one, but there are not that many, and there certainly aren't that many that represent Oakland in kind of this beautiful way and a way that really captures it. So there is really it. Yeah.
And that was such a surprise when that came. I mean, what an incredibly powerful book. I see a question in the audience. Yes, Mari.
Thank you. I am just awed by your book.
Thank you.
Tremendous. I'm a middle school librarian. I also work at Bookpassage. But I curate my middle school library looking for mirrors and windows for my students. So a mirror is a book where you see yourself, and a window is an opportunity for someone to look into the life of another person. When you were a middle schooler, did you ever find a book that was the mirror for you?
We're going to just repeat the question for the people online. Okay. So the question is, if when you were a middle schooler, did you ever see a book that was a mirror to you?
Yeah. Middle school, I think the first book that I read that I felt like was really a reflection of not only me but the way that like I viewed language too and understood language was Sassafras, Cypress, and Indigo by Ntozake Shange. And it's technically an adult book, but I think that the limitations of adult and YA and middle grade are all kind of unimportant in the end. But I think that I related to the way that she used language without like all of the I don't even think she used quotation marks and none of it mattered, but the story and the people and the characters and it also explored art and Black girlhood in a really beautiful way that I had never read before. So I definitely think that was one. Another Brooklyn by Jacqueline Woodson, which is she just does amazing things and kind of does that kind of genre bending and doesn't really care about middle grade and young adult and adult fiction. I think that that's always really important, especially for young people, that we don't like place them only in front of books that are supposed to be like appropriate for them.
That's a great question. Yes, Elsa.
So I'm also a staff person here, and I almost don't know what to say, because like her, I'm in awe of you, and I'm halfway through the book, and I'm reading it. I can't sit down and read the whole thing because I feel like I have to take it in bits and parts. Never read anything like this, and I just want to thank you so much for putting
Thank you.
all this. It makes me kind of emotional because this is so touching, and you're so amazing. But I did have a question. I'm wondering how much of this is autobiographical, and also I was so interested in the relationship between her and her brother, and just if you could talk about that a little bit, because I think it did several things for me. It sort of put me in this position of feeling judgmental, and yet because of that and because of the way you write, I was stepping back and really trying to be in her and how she's trying to help. So anyway, if you could just talk about that.
Yeah, thank you.
So the question is, sorry, if I can get it all.
Two of them. Yeah.
Two of the questions. One of them was about I'm sorry?
If it's autobiographical.
How much of this was autobiographical, and if any of it is. And the other thing is about the relationship with the brother, and if you could speak a little bit about that.
Yeah. I don't write autobiographical things unless I'm writing an essay, generally. But I think that parts of me and parts of my life end up in every book and every character. So I think that in many ways, especially because I was writing at 17 from the perspective of a 17-year-old, Kiara lived in an apartment like a block away from my house. So I think that there were definitely overlaps in ways that I borrowed from my own experiences. But I also think it's like part of the fun as a writer is getting to have your character be their own person. And so I also think that she's in many ways very separate from me. And then Marcus, yeah, I think that I worked really hard with Marcus because the first time, I think it was like the second draft of it, when people read it to give me feedback on it, they were like, I hate him. And I was like, wait, no, you're not supposed to like hate him. And I think that from there, I kind of tried to figure out what does it mean for us to be angry with him and still find kind of where Kiara is coming from and understand the love that she has for him, and also understand that he does love her even if he doesn't know how to. And so I worked really hard to kind of allow him to be someone that we can have strong feelings about across a spectrum of emotions throughout the book, and that we don't excuse him in any way, because this is Kiara's story, and if we excused him, then I think that we would be doing a disservice to her, and we couldn't fully understand who she is. But then at the same time that we understand that they have relied on each other for their entire lives. They kind of have only ever had each other, and that means that that Kiara feels like she loses kind of her entire family and in some ways herself if she loses Marcus. And so that creates this incentive to keep him no matter what, which I think ends up with her doing more than she ever should for him. But I think that that's often the case when we love someone that much.
He also is traumatized too, and he's a child too. You know, and I think we lose sight of that sometimes because we're so in her camp.
Yeah, he became her guardian at 18, and I think that she also feels like she owes him.
Yeah. Yes.
First of all, 20 years old. I feel like I need to go home and really write fast. Brava, brava.
Thank you.
So I recently heard Joy Harjo, the
love her.
say that fiction asks what happens next. Poetry asks what's happening now.
Mm.
Mm.
Do you agree with that as a poet and
That's
a
so
novelist?
interesting.
What do you say to that?
Could you repeat the quote?
Yeah. Fiction asks what's happening next, and poetry asks what's happening now. I mean, I think that's hard because it depends on the poet and it depends on the novelist, and so in some ways I think that often poetry is about what has already happened, and fiction kind of allows us the ability to see a large span of time, and understand how a character can be where they are now and also where they've been and where they're going, and we might actually never know where they're going. So I'm not sure. I think in some instances yes, but I think for me no.
That's really interesting. Yes.
Hi. I see that you have some tabs in your book.
Yes.
Is it possible for you to read a passage?
Yes. I can read a passage. Okay. I'm just going to pick one at random, I guess. We'll
I
see.
should have picked a color.
They're coordinated by time, so I'll see which one is short enough. Okay. All right. This one's like a minute, I think. This is after funeral day, which is it kind of begins the book. It's where Kiara and her best friend Ale are, they have a tradition, a ritual of going to different funeral homes and collecting food and clothes. And then this is afterwards when they're on the swings. Ale begins to swing her legs, me following her lead, going skyward. At the top, I think I might just enter one of those clouds. I look down, see a tent behind the basketball courts, and an old man pissing by a tree, not bothering to look around and see who is watching. I aspire to be so reckless, so unassuming that I could take a piss in San Antonio Park at noon on a Thursday and not even look up. You know what I've been thinking? Ale asks me. We're on opposite ends of the sky, swinging toward each other and missing, and for the first time all day, I'm not thinking about the paper taped to our door, about Marcus's sleeping face, about how wide Dee's mouth opens. What you been thinking? Don't nobody ever fix none of these damn roads. She says it, and I immediately begin to laugh, thinking she was about to tell me some philosophical wondering about the world. You don't even got a car, what you worried about? I yell back to her, across the wind and the space between our swings. Even as I say it, looking out at the streets that extend from the park like the legs of a spider, I see what she means. Chunks of roads sit beside holes they left behind, where wheels of broken down Volkswagens dip in, and for a second, I don't know if they're gonna pull back out until they do. The only remnant of distress left in the slight rattle of the bumper. All the holes in Oakland never seem to leave nobody stuck for long, an illusion of brokenness, or maybe that's just for the cars. Don't you ever think about how none of the streets around here been redone for decades? Ale, a skater to the core, spends more time dipping in and out of potholes than I ever have. Why it gotta matter? The roads ain't hurting nobody. Don't matter. I'm just saying it ain't like this nowhere else, you know? Why Broadway not this torn up? Or SF? 'Cause they puttin' their money in the city just like they puttin' their money into downtown. Don't you got a problem with that? Ale's whole body has risen from its slouch, and we're both slowing down now, returning from our sky. No, I don't got a problem with that. Just like I don't got a problem with Uncle Ty buying a Maserati and a mansion down in LA and leaving us out here alone. Just like I don't got a problem with Marcus spitting rhymes in a studio while I'm just trying to pay our rent. It ain't my place to have a problem with somebody else's survival. If the city get their money from paying to smooth over the roads on some rich-ass street, then they should go ahead and do that. Lord knows I won't be thinking about nobody else if someone offers me a wad of cash. I wiggle my toes in my Sunday shoes as the swing comes to a halt, and I feel Ale's eyes on me, determined. I don't believe none of that, she says. What you mean you don't believe it? She shakes her head, her own high making her slow. Nah, you got too much heart to be a sellout, Key. You ain't cruel enough for none of that. I know you wouldn't go leaving Marcus or Trevor or me just to make bank. I'd like to think she's wrong. But if she was, then I would stay on these swings all day. Get so high I don't have to think about nothing but Ale's tattoos and how the streets are fragmenting and will keep disintegrating until we are walking on dirt. Instead, I think of Marcus, how we used to stand on street corners trying to sell paintings I made on cardboard. It barely made us enough to buy more paint, but Marcus and I were in it together, choosing each other. It's time I go tell him I can't be doing all the hard shit for him if he ain't gonna do nothing for me. Tell him it's time to put the mic down and face these streets like I've been for the last 6 months. I gotta go find Marcus, I say, hopping from the swing set and seeing the world fuzz, go in and out of focus, all of it sharp yet spinning. I leave her there, on the swings, a puff of smoke exiting her lips like she was holding it in this whole time. And she don't even have to look at me again because now this blazer smells like her Sunday shoes. And today, on funeral day, that is all I need. Thank you.
Wow. You can hear how you're a poet in there. That's just amazing.
Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for writing this book.
Thank
I
you.
live in Maxwell Park, so
Yeah.
my neighborhood, and it's such a beautiful love letter to our neighborhood. Like you said, oh God, I'm gonna cry. So like I said, people I don't think really understand the realness of what happens. Oakland is a beautiful, culturally beautiful city, but there are girls literally getting swiped off the street on a daily basis. So thank you so much for writing this. I'm so proud of you for doing it. My question for you is, I work with a lot of girls at Chapter 510. I mentor them. And, I think people think that black girls or girls of color only get exploited when they're vulnerable. But they also get exploited when they're standing in their excellence. So what advice would you give to a young girl of how to protect herself from that exploitation?
So the question was, sorry, the question was that, the comment was that young black girls don't only get taken advantage of when they're in a when they're vulnerable, but also when they're standing in their excellence. So what advice would you give? Is that correct? Advice do you give to young black women?
I think in some ways there is no way to protect ourselves. And I think the illusion of being able to is part of why we end up feeling so lonely and isolated. Because I think in the same way that that black kids often get told, like, don't wear a hoodie, don't go out after the streetlights have come, like all of these things that we believe are going to prevent them from encountering any danger, often just don't work and are more for us to feel like we have some semblance of control. And I think that in the same way with black girls, like, it is hard out there, and it doesn't matter where you come from or who you are. And I think that for us to have an awareness that that we are not the ones who put ourselves in these positions, and nothing we do is the thing that is going to allow us to get hurt or not. I think that there needs to be like more people who are even cognizant of our harm or our vulnerability, and I think that parents and guardians and caretakers could do more in even acknowledging that when we go out, we are immediately in danger, and it doesn't matter where we're going. And I think that it's a challenge for us to like have to realize how unprotected we are. And I don't think there's anything that you can do as a single person to protect yourself, especially like as a young girl. I think that as adults, it's important that we try to protect kids' childhoods. But I also think that in this world, that's nearly impossible for Black kids.
I know there's a question online.
Yeah, Anne-Marie wants to know if you could describe the experience of having your novel selected for the Oprah Book Club.
All right, the question is if you could describe your experience of having your novel selected for the Oprah Book Club.
Yes. Okay, it was, I think, like 5 or 6 months before the book came out, and I was having a team Zoom meeting with my editor and my publicist and my marketing director, and my marketing director wasn't there, and I get on the Zoom and there's this guy I've never seen, and they're like, oh, he's your publicist's new assistant. So I'm like, okay, and they start recording the meeting for my marketing director who was absent, and then there's like this black box on the screen, and it says Penguin Random House. And I thought it was like some kind of technical glitch. And then they start by saying, like, unfortunately, we have to move your pub date back 2 weeks. And so I'm like starting to panic. And then the black box turns on, and Oprah Winfrey is just there. And she like has my book in her hands. And she sings congratulations to me. And I mean, there's no way to describe the like shock. And I don't even think I realized it for at least a few months. And then I got sent the book with like the sticker on it. And I was like, oh yeah, it's like, it's happening. And I don't know, like it does help you like realize that, you know, celebrities are people. And, you know, she struggled like anyone else to turn off her Zoom. And I think that made it a little less nerve-wracking. Yeah.
That's wonderful. Do we have any more questions? Yes, go ahead.
First of all, you are absolutely brilliant.
Thank you.
Just applaud yourself every day.
Thank you.
And be so proud of yourself. May we ask you what the subject matter is for your next book?
You can ask. I can't say too much about it, but it's in first person, but there are multiple point of views, and it is set in a very different place, but it continues to like explore in a very different way, like themes of Black girlhood and like forgotten Black girls.
This is her next book that we're talking about. Yes.
Yes, but I'm only halfway through, so.
Yeah. Do you know about when it'll be published? Do they have it?
Probably like 2 years.
Okay.
24, 25, yeah, really.
Wow. Did I see another question over here? Did somebody have? No? Well, we are at the hour, so wow, that ended up perfectly, and congratulations. This was amazing.
You.
Thank you all for being here,
Thank
and
you.
thank you so much, Leila, for everything. It was incredible. Leila will be up here to personalize your books, like I said before. If you're online and watching and want it personalized, please call the store, 415-927-0960, and ask for it to be personalized. And thank you again. Thank you for being here and joining us.
Thank you all.